the same pain
That's
thresholds.
so weird you say that. So my son, sorry, sticking in, but my son, he is autistic, and if he ever tells me he hurts himself, because he plays football, if he ever tells me he's actually hurt himself, he has broken a bone.
I think the first thing to recognise is when we're thinking about neurodiversity, just like when we think about personalities, culture.
For a child to be diagnosed is hard for the child, but also the grief for the parent is very hard as well. So how do you start that motion of essentially like a new lifestyle and a new life? What would your guidance be for that? I'm so excited to introduce our first guest on Unbrushed and Uncut. Today we're joined by Dr. Beth Mosley. Welcome, Beth. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Do you mind just introducing yourself and letting us know a few bits about what you've been up to in your field?
So I'm a consultant clinical psychologist, and I have been working with children and families for over 20 years now, largely in the area of mental health services. More recently, I've been involved with setting up parent workshop programs for families who may be asking questions about neurodiversity. And this has increased my interest in the work that I do already with young people in the NHS, where neurodiversity and neurodivergence are coming up a lot.
Absolutely.
As they're often the families that we're meeting who perhaps are waiting for assessment and diagnosis, and maybe struggling with issues around their mental health. I'm also the author of a book I've written called Happy Families.
It's an amazing book.
How to protect and support your child's mental health, which is really your go-to guide for any parent if you've got any questions about young people's mental health, right from when they're tiny all the way through to adolescence and young adulthood.
Perfect. So today I wanted to cover really what neurodiversity is. And I know this is a massively broad spectrum. I absolutely understand that. But I feel like it's becoming more prevalent at the moment. A lot more people are being diagnosed or thinking they're sort of coming up with symptoms. I think social media has played a massive factor in that. I found out through TikTok that I possibly may have ADHD and then went on to get diagnosis. So I just wanted to touch base, being a single parent myself, with people who may be struggling with their children and understanding them and stuff, explaining as well as you can, because absolutely I know it's such a broad thing. But for parents who are new to the concept, how would you define neurodiversity? That's a big one, I know.
It's a big question. And actually, I work in a mental health service, and even professionals are using the term differently and perhaps not using it as it's intended. So neurodiversity is often misunderstood, and it's used interchangeably with neurodivergence.
Okay.
So neurodiversity really describes that infinite natural variation of neurocognitive function. So the diversity of the human brain. So if you think about the word neurodiversity, it's covering that whole broad range of how human brains work.
Yep.
Neurodivergence is where the brain might be working slightly differently. There might be variation from the norm.
Okay.
So we often hear people talking about neurotypical individuals. Neurotypical individuals tend to be people who fit within the general way that brains typically work. And neurodivergence tends to be people who their brains might work in slightly different ways.
Okay. Is there any sort of concepts or anything that can fall under that, so parents could recognise if there may be something neurodivergent with their children? Are there sort of key elements that people could look out for? I know it can be very broad and very different for all sorts of different people.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to recognise is when we're thinking about neurodiversity, just like when we think about personalities, culture, we're looking at it as seeing it in a positive way.
Yes, absolutely.
We're looking to say this diversity brings lots of different things to the table. So I think more recently, in more recent times, the neurodiverse movement is all about embracing difference and encouraging it rather than stigmatizing it and seeing it as a disorder as such. So just to point that out initially.
Absolutely.
In terms of thinking about some of the labels that you might associate with neurodivergence, so things like autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and Tourette's, or what you might know as tics.
Yep.
So they're the type of presentations historically that have received a diagnosis which shows that somebody has brains that work in a different way, which show up with different sorts of behaviours.
Okay.
So, for example, autism, an autistic person may struggle with social communication and understanding social behaviours of others.
Yep.
They may find preferences for routines and structure. They may have additional sensory sensitivities. So they might find things in their environment can cause pain and distress, like bright lights, big noises. Or they might find that there are certain things that they don't actually feel like. For example, their experience of pain, they might not have the same pain thresholds.
That's so weird you say that. So my son, sorry, sticking in, but my son, he is autistic. And if he ever tells me he hurts himself, because he plays football, if he ever tells me he's actually hurt himself, he has broken a bone. And we always have to take him to A&E, and he has broken a bone, honestly. So his pain threshold is so much higher than anyone else's. And I did ask one of the nurses, actually, when we went to the hospital, is that a thing? And she said she didn't obviously say yes or no, but she said it has been known in autistic children that their pain thresholds are different.
I know we're going to talk about this more in a later podcast, but there is, for young people, autistic young people and adults, something called interoception.
Okay.
And what that term means is a difficulty in actually noticing bodily changes.
Okay.
So, for example, the experience of not feeling pain in the same way, or not feeling whether you're hot or cold.
Okay, I never knew that.
And so quite often autistic people might not notice the feelings in their body and make the connection around what that feeling is associated with in terms of the need they need to be met.
Oh, wow.
So I've worked with young people who say, I will literally turn blue with cold. I will not be feeling that I'm cold, and I'll need somebody to tell me, you are cold and you need to put on a jumper.
Wow.
How this shows up as challenges is that if you think about the feelings you experience in your body, so when you're feeling anxious, you might get butterflies in your tummy. When you're feeling sad or low, you might get that heavy feeling.
Yep.
For autistic people, they might not have that recognition of those same feelings, so they might be experiencing sadness or anxiety, but they won't be noticing the sensation in their body, so they'll find it really difficult to explain to another person how they're feeling.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that. I know I've gone off a bit off piece, but I think it's really interesting. I've definitely noticed that with my eldest, especially now he's hormonal, now he's 15. It's almost like he's more autistic sometimes with the hormonal changes, and he can't process or regulate that. And I don't think that's him being a typical teenager. I just don't think he's, like you were saying, being hot and cold and stuff, I don't think he's aware of it, like he knows. So that's really interesting. But I didn't know it could be a physical thing as well, with like being cold or hurting yourself.
Yeah, really, and I think it's so important, isn't it? Because if we trying to understand why it can be more difficult for a neurodivergent person in a neurotypical world,
yes,
we place a lot of expectations on people to explain what's going on in their bodies. And if you think about being a parent, you're kind of, if you notice your child doesn't seem quite right, you ask them what's wrong.
Yes.
And they might say back to you, I don't know.
Yeah.
And quite often we believe they do know. They're just not willing to tell us. But quite often for a lot of young people, they don't know, and they don't know how to put that into words that we would understand.
Yeah.
And so you can see how that can create problems around making that link with emotions, explaining needs to others, and then having those needs met.
Yeah, and the more you ask them, in my circumstances, is the more they revert because they don't know. And that's a really tricky thing to parent, absolutely. That's really interesting. So my next question for you is, how can understanding neurodiversity reshape the way we view our child's development and behaviours?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges about being a parent, especially, we have children from babies, don't we, where they can't communicate with us at all other than through crying, really, or not crying, So it's the biggest challenge of being a parent, I think, is decoding what's going on for your child and understanding what's on the surface and what does your child need and how can you meet those needs. And if we, as parents, and not just parents, but society and individuals, have a better understanding of young people who are neurodivergent, then we're much more likely to be able to understand what their needs are and then meet those needs, which will give them a much more positive experience of life and the world. And also from a relational point of view, as a parent, that kind of bonding and attunement you want to naturally have with your child can feel a lot more difficult if your child isn't behaving in a way that you're expecting them to. So if you can see and understand your child's behaviour through a different lens, then you're going to be able to meet their needs, but also feel like you're more connected and able to find ways to connect with your child. So the most important thing I think about this new way of understanding neurodiversity is it allows you to look through a strength lens rather than a deficit lens. So if we think about how we've described autistic people or maybe people with ADHD in the past, there might have been a lot of focus on all the things that they can't do. Or there also might have been a lot of focus on how they need to fit in order to be able to be understood. So pressure to, well, you need to maintain eye contact even if you find that really uncomfortable. Whereas with having that deeper understanding of how your child's brain works and what works well for them and what doesn't work well for them, you can create environments which are going to keep your child's nervous system much more settled. So if you say to an autistic child, you have to maintain eye contact while you're having a conversation with a person, it might be virtually impossible for them to have that conversation because the level of additional stress is putting on their system to maintain the eye contact.
It's intense.
Yes. So if you give that young person permission to not maintain eye contact, they may well then be freed, their mind will then be freed up because they're not under that additional stress to have that conversation or complete that task. So I think the beauty of understanding neurodiversity and understanding your child is that you can focus on understanding their strengths, what makes them tick, and then you can support your child's with their strengths to perhaps compensate some of the additional challenges that may face.
Absolutely. And I do think as well with neurodiverse children, adults, just people in general, I do think you do have to focus on the strengths because what sometimes they possibly lack on, they excel more than neurotypical people in other things, don't they? And I think that's something to celebrate in itself because obviously I know we're going to touch on this later, but with self-worth in neurodiverse people, that it's at an all-time kind of low. It's hard, because you're trying to figure out how to live this neurotypical life and that's not who you are. So I do think I found with myself and with my children to really celebrate those strengths, even if they're little wins for some people, they're massive for other people. Like Archie tying his shoelaces by the time he was 8, which is, I know it's quite late, but that was massive for him, and I needed to make sure that was a big thing. I do think it's tricky as well. It'd be interesting to get your side on this, but balancing a neurodiverse child with a neurotypical child, because celebrating Archie's little wins to my youngest who isn't neurotypical, that's a tricky one as well because they're completely different people, aren't they? So you've got to kind of try and find that balance within your household to be able to do that, if that makes sense.
Yes, and sometimes it needs a reframing of the thing that makes your child special in inverted commas. So for example, for an autistic child, they might really benefit from routine and structures and predictability. And they might have a real interest in details of how things work, for example. So if they're looking at a piano, they're less interested in the sound that's coming out in terms of listening to it as a piece of music and more interested in working out, well, how do those keys connect to the sound that's coming out? What's under the lid? I want to understand the mechanism of how this piano works.
Okay.
So for that young person, their view of the world is less interested in emotion and how other people interact socially, and more interested in, well, how does that work?
Yeah.
Now, if you think about all the greatest engineers and inventors in time, there'll be people who will be focused on how does that work. This morning, my printer wouldn't work, and I was trying to get it connected to the network, and it was asking me about Bluetooth, and I was just thinking, who invented Bluetooth? Like, I just got caught up.
I love that you've got from that to that. That's amazing.
I know, and I was just thinking, isn't it incredible that there are people out there who've invented printers, Bluetooth,
Absolutely.
the way that computers can connect to other computers to make them work. Now, those people will have a particular way that their brain operates. That might mean they're not going to be the people that walk into a room and start kind of talking to everybody and the star of the show.
Yep.
But instead, they walk into the room and they're trying to make sense of, how does this lighting system work in conjunction with the sound system? And I think there's something about seeing some of those traits that your child may have, which are quite irritating because they get in the way of them kind of meeting social norms. So if you've got an autistic child that you take to a party, for example, and they're more interested in working out how something's working in the room than they are in just kind of meeting other people, that as a parent might feel, I want them to just settle in. I want them to not kind of be in a corner, just focusing on some thing that they're super interested in right now. But actually, if you can reframe that as, my child is likely to be interested in how things work, which means they may contribute to something in the future, which is going to invent something new, then you can perhaps not see your child sitting in the corner of the room trying to understand how something works as a negative thing, but as, well, this is an important part of who my child is.
I love that.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely, because that's the thing, as a parent, say if you went to a party, you think, right, they should be having fun and they should be dancing, they should be, like you say, with everyone else. But actually, if their fun is sitting by the speaker system trying to work it out, who are we to say, as long as they're getting what they need to get from it? I think it's very hard to get out of that mindset of what we determine as children what they should be doing as to what they need. That's very different, isn't it? I've never thought of that way before, but that's interesting, because then if you drag that person away from what they're enjoying, then it's not fun for anyone, is it? And then it's just very stressful and it all just kind of explodes. You almost need to find the needs of your children, don't you? Which is hard to do, isn't it? Because neurotypical people, once you've met one person, you've met one person, haven't you? Everyone is so different. So to be able to find their little quirks as such, I suppose that's just a lifelong thing, isn't it, of knowing them. And as a mother, they've grown inside you. So I imagine, without being sexist, we know our children better than anyone, don't we? But that's really, I've never thought of it that way before, but that is very interesting. So next time, Archie's over by the speaker, I'm going to ask him, you can earn me a fortune.
Well, I think one of the other things you've touched on there is something called the double empathy idea. So this is an idea that's been talked about more and more recently. And the idea is that with neurodivergence, there's a challenge around double empathy. So I will explain that. So what we know is that autistic individuals, for example, can, when they're together, communicate with one another really well and understand one another really well.
Okay.
So the idea of the double empathy rule is that autistic people or neurodivergent people, whatever that neurodivergence might be, are struggling to understand neurotypical individuals because and empathise with the neurotypical individuals, because their way of viewing the world and the way their brains work is quite different. And at the same time, a neurotypical person is really struggling to understand what the neurodivergent person's communication needs or their view of the world. And so it creates this really difficult mismatch.
Yes.
I think in the past, it feels like the responsibility is sat with the neurodivergent person to adapt themselves to be more neurotypical looking, to make it more comfortable for the neurotypical person.
Yeah.
Whereas actually we're moving towards saying, no, the expectation shouldn't be that the neurodivergent individual becomes more normal, in inverted commas. And it's interesting because I've obviously worked with lots of young people. One of the things that I've noticed, particularly with autistic young people I've worked with, is that they've often described that if they've got other autistic friends, they don't have any problems with communicating or being understood.
Okay.
And in fact, I often would pair autistic individuals up at school to support one another.
Yeah.
And when they're in that space together, there's no anxiety, there's no
Really?
pressure. They communicate incredibly well and really enjoy those interactions. And another young person I work with actually volunteered to work with younger autistic children. And she said it's just so refreshing because I understand them and they understand me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this was something I hadn't really properly understood until I'd worked with these young people. So I think there's a general sort of misunderstanding that autistic people, for example, find communication difficult, but they don't find it difficult with other autistic people.
Just different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the double empathy idea is really important because I think what it demonstrates is that the neurotypical way isn't necessarily the right way.
Absolutely.
And often if we can modify our way of communicating to take the pressure off in some of those situations, then we can allow that neurodivergent person to communicate within the boundaries of what works for them.
Yep.
So, for example, I've met a doctor who had someone come into his consulting room and just was so distressed. And in the end, he established it was because the room was so bright.
Okay.
So he turned the light off.
And it was okay.
And then they were able to complete the whole session in the dark.
Wow.
And that person was completely able to communicate.
That's
but
amazing.
What you might conclude before turning the light off is this person can't communicate.
Yeah.
But actually they could communicate if those modifications were made. And I guess that goes back to the question, why is it so important to understand neurodivergence and understand that neurodiversity? And it's because quite often we can make environmental adaptations that will enable someone to take part in something in a way that perhaps they might not otherwise have done. Now that can create challenges, particularly in families, because parents might have different views on adapting things to make it easier for a young person.
Saving the electric bill though, that'd be brilliant.
Yeah, exactly.
So what advice would you give someone, they've gone through the system, I know obviously it's so overrun at the moment, but they've managed to go through the system and they've managed to get a diagnosis of any neurodiverse diagnosis, ADHD, autism. What would you advise to the parents for a newly diagnosed child, like the steps that they can possibly take? Because I found especially when Archie got diagnosed, as much as it was a relief that for what I thought was going on with him, for my experience, that was kind of that then. And I was like, I just didn't really know where to go with it. And I understand there's resources and stuff on the internet and stuff that you can go to. But is there any steps and things? Because for me as well, it was a very emotional thing because it's almost like a grief. Like I love my son more than anything. I don't know if you've ever read the poem Going to Holland. This lady wrote it. I don't know the name of the author. I need to find it out. But it's basically about, this poem is about these parents are all planning to go to Canada. They all pack their bags and stuff and they get ready and they go on this plane and they go to Canada. But when the doors open, they've actually arrived in Holland. And Holland's a beautiful place. It's got tulips and stuff, but everyone's coming and going from Canada. Mm-hmm. And you're not going where you're supposed to be going. And I think it's very hard because obviously for the child, it doesn't even have to be a child, but obviously in this aspect, we're talking about children. For a child to be diagnosed is hard for the child. But also the grief for the parent is very hard as well. So how do you start that motion of essentially like a new lifestyle and a new life? What would your guidance be for that?
Yeah, it's a really, really important question. And I think every parent's journey up until that point is obviously going to have been different. So for some families, this might be happening when their child is an adolescent.
Yeah.
and they've waited years to get to that assessment diagnosis appointment. And actually, maybe they didn't notice some of the challenges and identify them as being linked to neurodivergence when their children were younger.
Yep.
So that realisation, and I've worked with young people who might have got a diagnosis at 17, and that realisation that they perhaps are autistic or have ADHD is kind of, like you say, it takes time to process.
Absolutely.
I think whether your journey has been over a number of years or whether it's earlier in your child's life where you might have noticed those differences and been able to get that assessment early on. So I think these things take time to process. So there's something here about self-compassion and kindness to yourself as a parent. I think as parents, we're predisposed to feel guilty about everything.
Always, everything.
So I think you have lots of questions. Why? What does this mean? What does this mean for now? What does this mean for what's already happened? You know, what were some of the decisions I made as a parent about how I was going to respond to the way my child was reacting to that? You know, that kind of guilt around perhaps making decisions that you would have made differently if you'd known your child was neurodivergent and understood that. So you're probably going to be flooded with a whole range of thoughts and feelings. And again, this kind of grief question, what does this mean for now and for the future? What am I going to lose because my child is neurodivergent? And I guess that's where kind of coming back with that strengths lens is really helpful. So what are you going to lose because your child is neurodivergent, and what are you going to gain?
Yeah.
And I think it's not just the time that it takes you to process, but you've got a child who's asking questions. What does this mean about me and who I am? Does it mean there's something wrong with me?
Yep.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because autism is a disability, but the new language is it's not a disorder.
Okay.
So it's something that can have and is likely to be having an impact on a young person's quality of life and ability to function. But we're not considering it a disorder. So it's a bit confusing, isn't it? If your child says to me, is there something wrong with me?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you say, well, no, darling, there isn't. You're just different.
Yeah.
Well, that can feel to a child like there's something wrong with me.
Yeah.
So I
Do you think define different, like, you know? Yeah, it's
exactly.
tricky.
And I think the challenge is a lot of our societal norms are privileged and seen as positive. So being different isn't always seen as positive.
Yep.
So I guess, first of all, accept, as hard as it is, that you're going to have a range of emotions and it might take time to process those. And if you're if you've got two parents, then also you might do that differently.
Yeah.
So you might have different responses and reactions to that. And then I guess it's take your time to learn more, look for support from others. So I think one of the biggest things I've learned over the years is how valuable peer support is with other families who understand what you're going through.
Yeah.
It can be very isolating.
Absolutely.
And you might lose friends and family having a neurodivergent child because they might not agree with some of the decisions you make about how you're parenting your child because you have to do it differently.
Yeah.
So lots of people might have views, well, if that was my child, I'd make them sit and do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or I wouldn't allow them to leave the room when they don't like a big noise. So I think as a parent, you can end up feeling very isolated and that you haven't got other people to support you or even people who aren't willing to look after your child because they find it too difficult to manage.
Yeah.
So I would say finding your cheerleaders and those people you can trust and rely on and turning to peer support groups is invaluable. And so many families have described how meeting other parents of neurodivergent children has just helped them in so many levels. A, they've got people who understand them and their challenges and aren't judgmental and critical. And B, they can share tips of how they've been able to modify family life to meet some of those additional demands that come.
Yeah.
And parental stress is a huge thing in this space. So parental stress is all about the demands outweighing the resource that you've got. And when you've got any child, it's demanding. A neurodivergent child brings additional challenges because their needs might be different
Yeah.
and require more from you as a parent. But also societally and the system around you might not be giving your child what you need. So a lot of parents talk about the challenge around education and nursery settings, not being accommodating enough to meet their child's needs. So feeling that they've got to advocate for their children permanently, which can be really draining.
It's exhausting. Yeah. Have you found, just out of interest, have you found that people are now, obviously they're more aware of neurodiversity, and as their children potentially might be getting diagnosed, they are then looking inwardly, and have you found that then potentially there are more parents then getting diagnosed? Do you think that may be a thing? And also raising a neurodiverse child when you're undiagnosed and unaware yourself and they're triggering you, and then there's this conflict, and it's so hard, isn't it? And it's a lot more stressful if you don't know yourself. I think, not being sexist or anything, but the male species as well, they find that equally harder, don't they? Sort of going in and sort of finding out what's going on within themselves. I've definitely noticed within my society of friends with neurodiversity, it's sparked things like, oh, well, they've got that from me, and I do that. And then themselves in their 30s, 40s, 50s have then got diagnosed as well, which can obviously bring the family unit together that little bit more. And nice for the children, because they think, I said to Archie, I said, oh, I'm neurodiverse, because he was diagnosed way before me. And he was like, oh, like, you know, because they then aren't on their own either, are they?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We know there's a huge biological element to neurodivergence. So quite often when I meet with families and their child is going through the process of getting assessed and diagnosed, there is a realisation that either parent or both parents may also be neurodivergent. And actually for some parents, that's what's perhaps meant that they haven't noticed some of those differences that other people might have noticed.
Okay, all right, that makes sense.
So that sometimes is that an explanation for that. Sometimes we might see mum and not dad, and mum will be, well, they're just like their dad. And this explains why over the years we've had some difficulties in these areas. So absolutely, I think that a lot of adults are beginning to understand themselves better and why they've had some of the challenges they've had in their early life and their adulthood. And seeing those with a different lens, so that actually, you're right, that can potentially be really supportive, because it can give those adults the opportunity to reframe some of the things that have happened in their past and look to strategies and ways of managing those difficulties for themselves as well. But it can create challenges.
Absolutely.
Because like you're just saying, you know, if you find loud noises and uncertainty and breaks in routine really difficult, and your child does too, and is screaming and shouting to get away from a loud noise, or is getting really distressed about a change in routine, which is actually making a change in your routine because now you can't get to where you hoped you'd get to, then it can be, it can definitely add to the stress of the situation.
It's tricky. I've definitely found with Arch being autistic, and I know not every autistic child is like this, but he's very, he needs instructions like one thing after another, like one at a time. That's, you know, slow and steady. Whereas me being ADHD, I'm like, you know, and it's complete, like,
so real mismatch,
needs, you know. And it wasn't until obviously recently when I found out, I was like, that's why, as much as I love him, we had that disconnect a little bit, and it was tricky. But it's now easier, not completely, but, you know, I'm now aware of it, that you can manage that a little bit better. I do find it really interesting, because not always, but it tends to come genetically, I imagine. Is it more genetic than not, I imagine?
Yeah, so we know that there's a higher rate of autism or ADHD or neurodivergence in parents of children. So you see it runs in the family. So there is a genetic element to it.
Yeah,
definitely.
Also, this brings me perfectly onto our next questions, which are navigating parental conflict. So many families experience tensions when parents have different views about their child's needs and approach to support them. So what are the common sources of conflicts between two sets of parents?
This is a really interesting topic, and I've talked with some parents, but they're all mothers. So I want to caveat this is that I haven't spoken with as many fathers. But I think one of the things that they reflected on was that a lot of the stresses of bringing up a neurodivergent child are linked to differences in opinion on how to deal with or respond to a neurodivergent child's needs. And I think we can vouch for any parent who's in a relationship knows how much additional strain having children generally puts on relationships.
Absolutely.
It's hugely demanding, and we all have different ways of doing things, and we all have different triggers, and there are some things that you might respond really well to and your partner just can't, and the other way around. I think what I've learned is that quite often, and this is not a general, this is kind of what I've seen, but there are obviously going to be exceptions to this. But quite often mothers take the lead in being at medical appointments, spending often more time with their neurodivergent child, particularly in the younger years. So they often develop strategies and approaches to manage the challenges that come with parenting. And then fathers who may be less likely to be the main carer for that child, because quite a lot of mothers have to give up work in order to care for their neurodivergent child because they might be struggling to attend school and they might have a higher level of need. So quite often some tensions can come from fathers coming back into the space, not really having the same level of understanding around the young person's needs, and then wanting to assert perhaps a different rule book on how to respond, where the mother's saying, if we do that, I know that the meltdown that's going to happen next is going to destroy the rest of the night. So I would suggest we do it like this. And I think that's where some of the tensions come. And I think for any parent, but I've heard this from the perspective, particularly of fathers. There's a really interesting podcast on motherhood and fatherhood, which talked about how over cultures and communities, over history and time, mothers historically and now still tend to meet the role of nurturing children. They've got a very important role in providing that nurturance. And that doesn't mean to say men can't or fathers can't, but typically their role has been nurturing. And fatherhood's role is more around preparing young people for the real world, building skills and confidence. So if you think about tribal communities, the men in the tribe would take their children from very young ages out and teach them to hunt and help them learn the skills that they need to survive as teenagers and adults.
And it's very black and white, isn't it? Like that sort of rule of thumb, isn't it? You know, we go, this is what we're doing. And it's not always like that. And that's where the mother comes in, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose from speaking with some dads of neurodivergent children, their anxieties about perhaps overly accommodating their needs and changing the environment or not insisting that they do things in a particular way can sometimes come from the fear that if you overcompensate a lot as a parent, that in the future their child will not be able to get out there and cope in the real world.
Yeah, I get that. Also as well, I've always really struggled, and funnily enough, I was talking to a client about this yesterday, and this brings us perfectly onto sort of the last question. But how do you find the difference between still teaching your child right and wrong and boundaries and accommodating their neurotypical needs? And why I say this is because there was a topic years ago with Archie. I can't remember what he did, but he did something and he needed for boundaries to be put in place and to be, you know, mothered essentially. And he turned around to me and he said, but I'm autistic. And you know, when you're like, I get that, but you still need to know right from wrong, because I do feel there's a very fine line that they still need to be parented, don't they? And they still need to know the way of the world, because even though everything's evolving and changing in their benefits sometimes, they're still going to need those boundaries to be a good person. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting question, and I don't know what the research is. I'll have to look it up on parenting styles and neurodivergence. But there are a number of parenting styles that have been established. So one of them is authoritative, which is where it's very strict. It's all about boundaries and rules, and there isn't much warmth and care in there.
Yeah.
And then there's permissive parenting, which is at the other extreme, where there's really no boundaries and structure, and it's all about care and warmth.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's authoritarian parenting, which is confusing because it sounds very close to authoritative. But authoritarian parenting is where you're providing those boundaries and structure and clarity around that and consistency. I think that's a really important part of this, is consistency. But you're also providing that warmth and care. So I often refer to it as the two hands of parenting. You know, you need both of them. You need the warmth and care, and you need the boundaries and structure. And then there's neglectful parenting, where you're just doing none of it, really. Yeah. So what we know is generally the young people who are brought up by parents who are providing that authoritarian care are the ones who tend to do better, have better life outcomes and better relationships and better self-esteem. And I guess what you can find in households is that one parent might be authoritative and the other parent might be a bit permissive, and that might be to compensate for the authoritative parent, which I can imagine happens a lot in families. But really the goal is for both of you to kind of work together to provide consistent boundaries and structure, but also warmth and care. And I think that's what you're really talking about. And for, I guess it's different depending on your child. And for an autistic child, structure, routine, understanding what's coming next are very important. The environment and life feeling predictable are so important. And that can be really challenging as a parent, because depending on the level of tiredness you've got, your kind of mood, what you've already been through today, where you're at, you know, generally, your consistency as a parent can really fluctuate.
Absolutely.
You know, some days you can be exhausted and you can't even be bothered to reinforce a boundary because you're just too tired and you've had enough.
Yeah.
Other times you're going to, you know, one small thing and you're going to be like, right, that's it. Your PlayStation's banned. You're never having a friend over again. And so you can see for a neurodivergent young person, the more unpredictable their parent might be, the harder that's going to be for them to manage.
Yeah.
So there's something about, as a family, how do you come together? And I do this with neurotypical families all the time, because this is a problem for all families.
Yeah.
Is how do we make more transparent what our family rules are?
Yeah.
And how we want to operate as a family. And that can particularly become an issue around adolescents, where adolescents just become a bit more disrespectful.
It's fun.
Yeah, exactly. And so often I say, come round the table together as a family and just write out together what your family rules are.
Yeah, I love that.
And what that looks like if you're not following them, and what that looks like if you are following them. So making that as concrete as possible.
Yeah.
Now that will be helpful for any neurodivergent child, whether that might be ADHD or autism, because you're being really explicit about what those rules are and why.
Yeah.
And why it's important to everyone around the table, because something that might be really important to you as a mum, that everybody says thank you for their dinner or takes their plate to the dishwasher rather than just leaving the table and running off, that might not be of any relevance to someone else in the family. But what you're trying to do is help people understand
each other.
Yeah. And that some rules might call them rules of civility, are valuable because they are supporting someone else get their needs met, because then you'll be a happy mom and you'll make dinner with a bit more joy tomorrow because you feel like everybody actually appreciated it.
And I suppose as well that's a really good concept to even take through to their adult life and their families, or any source of, you know, with work or relationships or anything, to set those boundaries and understand each other. Because I feel like as a family, people don't sit down and be like, this is how I'm feeling. Really, do they? Or take that time to understand each other. So that's it's a good tip, just to sit down and just write things out.
Yeah, and you can find out what's really triggering for your teen, or for, you know, because we don't often know sometimes as parents the things that we're doing, which really pee them off.
Yeah, I think just breathing for mine.
Please stop
He's
breathing.
not a fan
Yeah.
of me. But yeah, it's getting to the point where they're comfortable enough, I suppose, to open up for that, isn't it? You know, when they're in their home, they're feeling safe over dinner or something.
Yeah, and for a lot of young people, they might find the word element of it quite hard. So coming up with examples and consequences as well. Like if you need, there are times when you're going to have to enforce a consequence for something when, or else it's not going to feel like, for example, my son had his friend over for a sleepover, and in the middle of the night, I don't know what possessed them. Well, they didn't go to sleep for a start, and they came down and had a massive food fight in the kitchen.
Oh no.
And honestly, it took me hours to clear up. And I was livid with my son because he absolutely knows that is not acceptable.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm navigating in my mind. He's got an adolescent brain. Him and his friend got hyper. They were having a fun time and they weren't thinking about the consequences, and actually didn't care about the consequences because their adolescent brain was just saying, this is fun. Exactly. So there's me as a parent empathising with he's a adolescent brain not thinking straight. And then the other side of me that's like, how can he be this disrespectful about the home? I've got tomato seeds embedded on my sofa cushions, No. But I haven't agreed this consequence with him, which for some neurodivergent young people might be unbearable because it's not agreed. So I'd say agree consequences rather than doing what I have done. And so I've just said his friend was supposed to stay over for a sleepover on his birthday. And I've said, I'm really sorry, but he is not staying over for a sleepover on your birthday now.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And that wasn't an expected consequence, I admit, but my child is neurotypical and he can handle that.
Right.
But, the reality is I can't have that situation happening again. Mm-hmm. And I don't think me just saying, please don't do that again is going to be enough, actually.
Yes.
For him or his friend. So I think that's an important thing to think about as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, we've finished for today. Thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. Where can people find some information if they want to get in touch, or where can they get your book from to get some more information from that? That'd be amazing.
Yeah, so I'm on most social media, and it's Dr. Beth Mosley, DrBethMosley. That's my sort of tag. And also the same, my website's the same.
And MBE, let's just
.com.
put that in there as well.
Yeah, that's not in any of my social media tags. But yeah, so you can find me on Instagram, and I've got a website which has got, I write a blog, and I've got lots of top tips and free resources. And my book is just available everywhere really, in any good bookstore, and Amazon as well, Happy Families. And the wonderful thing that I've been so proud of with Happy Families is how many countries it's been published in.
Is it 8?
It's 8 or 9. I'm losing track. So it's in America. So I say it's 8 different languages, but 9 different countries, because it's been published in America too. But in China, I just think, isn't that a wonderful thing that countries which don't have access to some of the kind of mental health support and care that we do in this country. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Romania has got very limited support through their health service.
Right.
So it's really given families the things that they need to know at their fingertips. So,
I love that.
Yeah, it's great.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Beth. And
You're
we'll
welcome.
see you soon. Thank
Bye.
you.